Hey guys, welcome to Y&R Daily Update YouTube channel. Today's topics: The Young and the Restless. Spoilers, Monday, full August 25, 2025. Genua City has always thrummed on the razor's edge between ambition and fallout. But the weak Kane Ashby stepped out of the shadows with a plan that sounded like a promise and a dare. The pulse quickened into something like inevitability. His return was not a grand trumpet blast or a boardroom coup staged 4 column inches. It was a measured re-entry, a man who had learned how fragile empires are when built on excuses and how quickly momentum withers if it isn't given a track to run on. He called the track his train, a private joke that wasn't really a joke, because Kane came back convinced that the only way to move past the wreckage of mistakes and half-choices was to commit to a destination and gather the right passengers. People who were hungry enough to keep their hands on the throttle even when the grade steepened and the lights flickered. One of those people, maybe the only one with a tolerance for risk that could match his own, was Phyllis Summers. She didn't so much agree to board as she materialized on the platform with her bags already packed. Eyes bright, radiating that mischievous confidence that said she'd studied the map and circled the pitfalls and wanted them anyway. It would have been easier if momentum alone could carry a plan into existence. But Kane had learned not to trust easy, so he started with the hardest thing: honesty. He told Phyllis that her knack for showing up exactly when the ground shifted wasn't a flaw, it was her edge. He told her that he wasn't stalling for sport. That some dreams don't deserve to be shattered, but they do demand to be scrutinized. And that there were voices he needed to hear before he signed any dotted line. Voices belonging to kids who had learned, too young, that the grown-up world doesn't always keep its promises. He hadn't heard back from them yet, and the silence wasn't punishment, but it wasn't permission either. Phyllis listened, weighed the subtext, and refused to let silence become an excuse. If he needed a reason to hold, she would be the reason to move. "Give me a project," she said without saying it, "something big enough to justify this train and complicated enough to challenge my appetite." Kane already had the word in his pocket. A buzzword and a battlefield: artificial intelligence. He said it the way a climber points to the mountain. That has already killed people in ads. We're going anyway. AI in Genoa City terms was not a hobby. It was an accelerant, a promise to turn gut instinct into prediction and personal charisma into scale, a way to knit together the disparate edges of commerce, media, hospitality, health tech, and security into a lattice of data that could move faster than any single executive could. Phyllis didn't flinch. She danced on the line between visionary and incendiary too many times to be cowed by a new acronym, but she also didn't pretend the risks were ornamental. AI was thrilling precisely because it was frightening. Thrilling because it tempted everyone to skip the guardrails and call it innovation. Frightening because the minute you tried to tame it with ethics, someone somewhere called you slow. Kane asked her to do the unfashionable thing: become an expert, not in the splashy demo, but in the boring architecture, privacy regimes, bias, audits, provenance, tracking, model debugging. Subscribe our channel for more latest update, the kind of under-the-hood rigor that turns a clever prototype into an enterprise platform that won't implode the first time a headline lands. It was the opposite of flattery, and that's why it worked. Phyllis could sell and charm and blitz. But what kept her in the game after bad beats was stamina. If he needed a specialist, she would become one. Not to wear the credential like jewelry, but to speak the language so fluently no one could patronize her in a meeting again. She started with questions that signaled intent. What problem will we solve first? Whose data will we refuse, even if it's easy? Which failure mode will we treat as catastrophic so we never normalize it? Kane's eyes steadied. The train had a conductor. Meanwhile, across town at a table that had seen too many family briefings and corporate war plans, Devin Winters clocked the faraway look in his sister's eyes and asked the question that was less about the present and more about the pattern. "Why are you distracted?" Lily Winters didn't sugarcoat it. She was tired of hearing her own voice circle back to the same subject. Tired of letting the gravitational pull of Kane's name distort the orbit of her day. It is a special kind of exhausting to be done with someone and still feel the echo of their choices. She shook it off, not because she was minimizing the weight, but because there was another weight on the table: Nate Hastings. Devin laid out the obvious. Nate wasn't okay and then nudged past it. Grief is a storm everyone recognizes from the sound of the wind. But what made it vicious for Nate wasn't only that he had just buried his brother. It was the timing. The way a separate truth detonated before the grave dirt had settled. Audra Charles, the partner who had once made sharp look like a virtue, stood revealed in ways that Devon couldn't entirely soften with euphemism. The picture that had been painted for months, a canny player whose ruthlessness could be channeled toward shared goals, was peeled back, and underneath was something more corrosive. A pattern of self-interest so relentless it mistook vulnerability for leverage. Lily, pragmatic to the bone, said the silver lining out loud. If there was a moment designed to expose the cost of that kind of alliance, this was it. Payne clarifies. Maybe Nate was finally seeing not the sizzle of potential, but the bill that always comes due. On any other week, those currents might have run parallel. Personal grief in one lane and corporate maneuvering in another. But Genoa City never respects lanes for long. As Phyllis dug into her assignment with unsentimental focus, she also watched the web of alliances that could make or break the rollout of any ambitious technology. Chancellor Winters had become a byword for smart growth with guardrails, a rare conglomerate that understood value was more than this quarter's chart, and yet even they were not immune to triangle pressure when legacy and legacy grudges collided. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. Ziabo Newman and the orbiting satellites of boutique ventures and private equity funds all centered the same thing on the wind. Whoever domesticated AI in a way that played across media, retail, logistics, and customer experience would hold the marginal advantage in almost every negotiation that followed. Phyllis's route into expertise was not an academic sabbatical. It was field reconnaissance. A tour of labs and vendors and think tanks that clarified where the bragging ended and the engineering began. She learned fast that the market was littered with brittle toys dressed like platforms, and she built a short list of real contenders who could serve as core or spine while she and Kane layered on proprietary use cases. She held calls at unfriendly hours with compliance veterans, who could recite the difference between opt-out and opt-in from memory, and explain why the distinction would be the difference between a product that scales and a lawsuit that fierce. She mapped a curriculum for herself, and then a roadmap for the venture, a series of sprints that began not with a press release, but with a pilot that would be impossible to misunderstand. Fraud interdiction and revenue assurance for hospitality and retail properties were identity theft, chargebacks, and synthetic accounts had become a silent tax. Make money by saving money, she wrote in her deck. And by legitimacy, by protecting the people who can't protect themselves. Kane didn't hover. He read, asked, prodded when clarity slipped into jargon, and kept his promise to hold on the final green light until he'd spoken to the kids. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. Maddie and Charlie had become adults in the time it took him to decide that good intentions without boundaries can be a slow-motion injury. Their blessing mattered not because he needed permission to breathe, but because he refused to build anything that would smell to them like a fresh version of old chaos. The irony was not lost on him that artificial intelligence was born to devour data, and his new ethic was born to say no. That tension between what was technically possible and what was morally bearable would be the signature of the platform if they built it right. So he and Phyllis named the internal framework before they named the outward-facing product. Lantern, a set of rules that determined what data was lit and what remained dark. A bias buster combined with a provenance ledger and a kill switch, wired to trip at the slightest whiff of drift. If you couldn't prove where an input came from, you couldn't use it. If an output couldn't explain itself, you couldn't ship it. In a market hooked on move fast, their heresy was to move deliberately and then move with overwhelming speed, once safety was real. Back at Chancellor Winters, Devon translated personal concern into institutional steadiness. He made time for Nate, without foisting pep talks on a man who didn't want them, and he quietly removed choke points inside the company so that pressure wouldn't compound where grief already pressed. Lily, reading her brother's cues the way siblings do, trained her attention on the tectonics the Audra revelations might trigger. In the larger ecosystem, the immediate risk was reputational. Whispers that Audra backed into a corner she built for herself would start shopping around doctored narratives to regain leverage. The longer-term risk was strategic drift, the temptation for shell-shocked executives across town to chase flashier promises. Precisely because rigor now sounded like restraint. If leadership is a story you tell with your calendar, Lily and Devon spent their hours in rooms where candor was expected and gossip was bad form. They recommitted to the principles that had kept Chancellor Winters durable: transparency, accountable growth, a bias toward building rather than stripping. And they left the door open to collaborations that matched those values without needing headlines as a signing bonus. That was the opening Phyllis had engineered, without announcing it. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. when her first white papers came together. Technical brief on model interpretability, legal memo on consent taxonomy, operating manual for incident response. She didn't attach them to a breathless sales pitch. She sent them to Kane and suggested that if he wanted the first passenger car on his train to be worthy of the track, they should bring the package to Devin and Lily. Not as a get-rich lure, but as a get-right invitation. The demo would be modest by design, a pilot within Chancellor Winter's hospitality and retail partners to neutralize a surge in account takeovers and refunds fraud with human review kept in the loop and a third-party auditor embedded from day one. The incentive was straightforward and defensible. The optics were positive without being performative. They even floated a philanthropic arm named in honor of the family loss that had recalibrated the city's mood. A grant program for non-profit clinics to use privacy-preserving AI to detect drug interactions and paperwork errors before they harmed patients. A quiet nod to Nate's world that didn't trade on his grief. Kane read it twice and found something, like relief rising, where caution had been. This wasn't a trick. It was a plan you could explain to your kids. The convergence might have been smooth if Genoa City ever permitted smooth. Audra, armed with fragments and innuendo, and perhaps an assist from a few opportunists who preferred the old volatility, seeded a rumor that landed with surgical precision that Kane's AI shop intended to ingest personal data far beyond anything reasonably disclosed, including the social footprints of family members who had not consented, children included. It was a smear tailored to his exact scar tissue, and it hit like a body blow. For a heated day and a half, the city hummed with anxious speculation. In private, Kane's jaw said in a line that Phyllis recognized from her own worst afternoons, the instinct to burn everything down before you watched it topple was strong. Instead, she opened the lantern binder. They had designed the system to be auditable by an adult in a hurry. Clear logs, cryptographic receipts for every input, a policy registry with version control and signatures. She called Devin and Lily, not to plead, but to invite. And within hours, a small table was assembled with a compliance officer, an external privacy lawyer, and a data ethics professor who'd been waiting for a company to actually mean it when they said, "Inspect us." The inspection was brisk, thorough, and unsentimental. The logs did not lie. The rumor did. No scraping of minors, no dark harvesting, no shadow enrichment of profiles. What the platform refused to collect was as explicit as what it permitted. That alone would have been enough to steady the train, but the aftershock produced the kind of clarity that changes the slope of a story. In the process of walking through their controls, Phyllis demonstrated a kill switch drill that terminated a test model mid-inference, when its confidence interval wobbled outside spec, then restored it from a clean checkpoint with a note in the ledger that a child could understand. Devin watched the choreography and saw not theater but habit. Lily, who had spent years translating ambition into sustainability, recognized the rare thing in the wild, a system and a team that had been built to tell the truth to their future selves. This was what Chancellor Winters had been trying to prove, in 100 different contexts, that governance isn't the enemy of speed, it is the precondition. The rumor died faster than most because there was nothing to feed it, and by the time the city's professional whisperers switched topics, the pilot had a start date and a sunset clause and a reporting framework that would make future partnership either obvious or unnecessary. For Nate, the timing was both cruel and kind. The spectacle of a rumor weaponized against someone else's vulnerable spot was a mirror he hadn't asked for, but it showed him what he needed to see. Audra Uncray's apologies, when they came, were polished enough to read as strategy, and strategy was no longer what he was hungry for. He was hungry for decency, for the kind of power that restrains itself, for the kind of victory that doesn't require someone nearby to bleed. Grief doesn't vanish because a person makes one better decision, but it loses a little of its grip when the world around you stops rewarding the very traits that hurt you. Devin didn't gloat. Lily didn't preach. And Chancellor Winters did what the company always promised it would. Lower the temperature until the next right move was findable. Nate took a step back from Audra, not as a performance, but as an act of self-preservation. The first brick in a boundary that wouldn't be negotiated on a whim or a lonely night. Kane, for his part, finally got the calls that mattered. They weren't movie speeches. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. They were practical and protective and unafraid to ask the questions kids ask. When they have learned what questions keep them safe, what happens if someone abuses this thing? Who gets to look at what and when? What does Dad do if money starts talking louder than the rules? He answered with Lantern, with the audit, with the part of himself that had wanted a shortcut for too long and now wanted the opposite. He told them the truth that he would build the kind of thing that could survive scrutiny because he wanted to survive it too. When the calls ended, he didn't need to perform relief. He wore it in the loosened set of his shoulders. The green light he gave Phyllis afterward wasn't a drumroll. It was a handshake, simple and binding. The first month of the pilot read like a case study, and not by accident. Fraud losses edged down in measurable increments without tripping false positives that would alienate loyal customers. The blended team of human reviewers and model monitors found a rhythm that felt less like a checkpoint and more like a nervous system. The third-party auditor filed reports that were boring in the best way. More interesting than the metrics was the culture that developed around them. A disciplined impatience that pushed for improvements while refusing to blow past evidence. Phyllis, who could thrive on adrenaline, found a new kind of high in a dashboard that stayed green because the work underneath it was clean. Devin and Lily, allergic to empty flash, discovered that the quiet confidence of a well-run experiment generates its own kind of heat. The kind that attracts partners who don't want their names in lights so much as their operations out of triage. None of this transformed Genoa City overnight. That was never the point. What changed was subtler, and therefore stronger. An understanding among the people who actually moved the levers, that speed and care are not antagonists when designed together. A reminder that rumors don't have to be outrun if they can be out. A demonstration that grief does not have to curdle into cynicism if your friends and colleagues refuse to monetize your worst day. Audra didn't vanish. People like her rarely do. But the space she occupied shrank because fewer deals were willing to be structured around appetite alone. In that narrowing, Nate found room to breathe, the kind of breathing that lets a person recover their medicine, their craft, their ability to help without needing to be the hero of every room. By the time Kane's train cleared its first mountain pass, the metaphors had stopped needing to be spoken. The work spoke. Lantern had become not just an internal protocol, but a calling card. The kids' questions had become a checklist that lived beside every milestone. Phyllis's crash course had matured into a practice that she could teach without theatrics. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. There would be setbacks, vendors who oversold, regulators who overreached, rivals who misrepresented. But the team had proof now that they could tell the difference between noise and signal. Devin and Lily didn't need to adopt the platform as a trophy to benefit from it. They needed only to let it do what it was designed to do in the domains where it fit and say no where it did not. That kind of selective courage is the hardest kind because it lacks the drama of the Olenbet. But it is the kind that accumulates power you can sleep beside. In the quieter hours, Genoa City has a few if you know where to find them. Phyllis sometimes allowed herself a private inventory. The jobs she'd saved by force of personality. The bridges she'd burned and rebuilt. The times when winning felt suspiciously like escaping. This new thing, this careful revolution landed differently. It wasn't penance exactly, but it was a correction she could believe in. She and Kane had taken a technology famous for its ability to impersonate certainty, and taught it how to confess. And that felt like a contribution measured in more than quarterly returns. When she thought about what came next, anomaly detection for supplier fraud, adaptive scheduling that respected human limits instead of grinding them, translation layers that made customer service kinder. She didn't feel the usual itch to hurry the future into the present. She felt the steadiness of a train that will arrive when it should because someone respected the grade and measured the brakes. So, yes, Kane Asheb gave Phyllis Summers an assignment. And yes, Devin and Lily met in a moment that could have soured into cynicism and chose steadiness instead. Between those lines lived the actual story. Phyllis came back to Kane not with triumph, but with the kind of news that tightens a room. Saying, in a steady, careful cadence, that she had finally reached the twins, and that the cost of her delay had been exacted in full. They were furious that she had kept parts of the story from them. And worse, they were shattered by the realization that forgiveness toward their father could not be conjured by a single good plan or a polished promise, because time had taught them to distrust momentum that arrived without accountability. And they wanted to know why adults in Genoa City always seemed to make decisions first and remember to consult the people most affected only when those decisions were already galloping toward impact. The admission landed with the weight it deserved, and for a moment, the project they had named and armored with safeguards felt like it belonged on a siding because he had insisted the first green light would never outpace family. But then Phyllis added the piece that transformed paralysis into next steps. explaining that Devon had heard, understood, and volunteered to step into the breach, as an uncle, rather than an executive, offering to speak to the twins privately and off-screen, not to manipulate their stance, but to dignify it. To find out what harm had occurred and what boundaries would be required if any path forward were to be morally bearable. Kane did not mistake the gesture for absolution, yet he recognized the rare good design of it. The conversation would belong to the people who needed it, not to the city's rumor mill or to the theatrics of corporate redemption arcs, and the timetable would be set by grief and anger rather than by the itch to announce. That choice did not stall the work so much as purify it, while they waited for Devon's quiet diplomacy to do what public speeches never could. Phyllis and Kane tightened the lantern framework, translating what the twins' questions had already revealed into concrete guardrails that would outlive apology, writing down in sober language that the platform would not touch the data of minors, that any model drift would trigger automatic shutdowns with auditable receipts, that ethics reviews would be funded and independent rather than ornamental and captive, and that no financial windfall would justify the compromise of provenance, consent, or inability. Each line was a promise to the kids as much as to customers, and for Kane, it became a method to hold his pulse steady, because the doing calmed with the waiting inflamed. On the other side of town, Nate stood in a different room with a different kind of silence, sitting between him and the woman who had always treated truth as a negotiable instrument, and he dismantled the fog, the way a clinician dismantles a myth, naming the hinge questions one by one until the shape of things appeared. He did not believe Audra had simply and suddenly decided to step away from Bronte out of principle. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. He did not accept that her exit had been clean when every exit she had staged before was a pivot into a newer ladder. He did not accept the version of nice in which nothing happened because every piece of context whispered that too many small calculations had been made there. The kind of compartmentalized moves that feel clever in the moment and then metastasize into a pattern someone else has to bleed for. He offered a last chance not as a dare but as a test of whether something essential could be salvaged. Tell the truth now, not the embellished truth with deniability baked in, but the factual truth that punches a hole in your own narrative, and then perhaps there is a bridge that can be rebuilt plank by plank. Fail, and he would be gone because staying would mean participating in harm. What he received in return was the oldest play in the city. A counter-accusation wrapped in a rhetorical question asking whether he would really tear down everything, on the strength of a rumor. As if whispers had not so often been the first contour of reality in Genoa City. As if she had not built a career on incubating other people's doubts until they gave her leverage. He watched her reach for what had always worked: deflection, misdirection, a fresh target, and his chest tightened when she shifted the argument, asking if he was going to accuse her of taking a covert assignment from Victor Newman to wedge Kyle Abbott away from Claire Newman, which told him everything he needed to know, even if he never discovered the documentable proof. Because the very specificity of the innocent script told him she had gained the possibilities rather than interrogated the ethics. And what he needed after burying his brother was not a partner who could outfox allegations, but a human being who instinctively chose not to be in rooms where those allegations were born. He did not perform fury. He simply withdrew the one asset she could not counterfeit, his attention, and he left the room with the kind of quiet that means a person has finally stopped negotiating against their own sanity. While those threads unspoiled, Devon did what he said he would do, calling the twins in a manner that made clear this was not a conference or an intervention, but an invitation to name harms. He affirmed what they already knew: that adults with power to often confused urgency with righteousness and landed debris on the people they loved. And he refused to weaponize his own influence, even when it would have been expedient, instead, laying out facts the way you lay out tools and refusing to press one into their palms, explaining what Lantern was and what it was not, what it would do in specific, verifiable terms, and what it would refuse even if the market rewarded corner cutting. And then he asked if they wanted to read the policy drafts themselves rather than take anyone's word for their content. He offered to stand down entirely if the very idea of the project reopened wounds they were not ready to expose to air. He offered to bring in a third-party ethicist of their choice. He offered to negotiate clauses that would make their boundaries binding on paper rather than decorative in conversation, including clauses that would allow them to trigger a freeze if future behavior breached present promises. He offered, most importantly, the right to be furious, for as long as it took without anyone rushing them to the performative endpoint of reconciliation. Off-screen did not mean offhand. It meant preserved from spin. And the proof was in the way. The call closed, not with smiles, but with a calendar invitation for a follow-up and a request for read access to the compliance folders. Devin hung up and did not declare victory, because the only victory that would matter would be one the twins could live inside without flinching. He forwarded their requests to Kane and Phyllis and watched the two of them fold the requirements into the backbone of the work rather than staple them onto the exterior, clauses appearing beside existing provisions like they had always belonged there, and no exceptions prohibition on scraping public social surfaces. A bright line separation between security use cases and any marketing functionality, a transparency dashboard visible to named stakeholders outside the company, and a whistleblower channel funded to outlast management churn. The work itself became the apology, and the apology became legible not because of eloquence, but because of architecture. Audra, deprived of Nate's attention and sensing the city's appetite for drama slipping away from her, doubled down on the one remaining currency she had always been able to spend. Rumors sculpted as narratives seated in the precise corners of Genoa City that amplify speculation into presumption, telling anyone who would pay with their outrage that Kane's AI venture was nothing more than a velvet trap designed to harvest the behavioral footprints of families, that partners were being promised clean audits even as shadow and enrichment pipelines hummed in the walls, that the very people preaching ethics were privately coaching teenagers on how to tell a more forgiving story to protect their father's capital. The tactic had punctured softer operations in the past because the targets had only assurances to wave around. But this time the attack found less oxygen, not because the city suddenly grew wise, but because the project had been wired deliberately to be when the rumor reached Chancellor Winter's council, the response was not a press release, but an invitation to another independent review. And when the reviewer asked to see everything, including the parts that would normally be redacted, he was given the vault and a chair and asked to take his time. The ledger showed exactly what the public claims had promised. No ingestion of minors' data. No covert scraping of social surfaces. No enrichment beyond consented scopes. Kill switch drills recorded in timestamps that matched the policies. Trigger thresholds and receipts for every model checkpoint restore with the checksums to make forgery impossible. By the time the reviewer closed the laptop, his report read, almost boringly, the way truth tends to read when it has been engineered rather than improvised. The rumor did not die because it had been refuted in a viral thread, but because the few people who actually decide which projects live stopped finding reasons to doubt the defense. Audra had counted on spectacle. What she encountered was governance. None of that soothed the twins overnight, and no one pretended otherwise, least of all Kane. What it did do was move the conversation from the abstract to the practical. When Devin reported back, he did not offer sentiment. He relayed requests phrased like conditions, and everyone in the room treated that as the gift it was. The kids wanted hard vetoes on any pivot that would steer Lantern from security and safety toward marketing profiling. They wanted a sunset clause on the pilot that required an affirmative reauthorization with a fresh ethics review rather than a lazy rollover. They wanted a covenant that guaranteed a portion of net new savings would be committed to community clinics for medication safety rather than to executive bonuses because money speaks and budgets revealed truth. They wanted the right to read the quarterly incident reports themselves. Kane accepted all of it without ceremony. And when he sat down to draft a letter to his children, his pride screamed for one more round of grand gestures, but his better judgment won. And what he wrote instead was a short, unadorned inventory of commitments made and mechanisms available to them if he failed to keep those commitments. He told them he understood why forgiveness did not fit yet and that he did not need it in order to be obligated to behave. He said he was building the kind of thing he hoped the younger version of himself would have been safer around. He mailed the letter and went back to work because that was the only proof worth offering. As for Nate, the decision to step away from Audra did not repair the hole in his chest, but it did halt the draft. The energy that had been poured into managing her contingency plans was suddenly available for other uses. And he spent it where it would make sense, even if the city never applauded. With families caught between grief and paperwork at the hospital, with interns who needed a model of what accountability looks like after a mistake, and quietly with the Lantern Clinic pilot that had been designed specifically to prevent the kinds of avoidable errors that tend to hurt the already overburdened. Volunteering as a skeptic first and then as a collaborator when the system showed him it had earned the right to scale. Watching a model flag a dangerous drug interaction that harried human eyes might have missed did not erase his losses, but it snipped a thread in the narrative that said nothing in Port Charles. No, in Genoa City ever improves without extracting. A price from the vulnerable. Here was a thing designed to extract less. He signed on to a formal oversight panel not because Kane had asked. Kane had learned not to conscript, but because Devon and Lily had made it clear the panel would retain independence even when it hurt. It was not an embrace of any one person. It was a commitment to a practice. The city remained itself. Corporate feints and reconciliations. Family dinners where loyalty and resentment jostled for chair space. Boardrooms where legacy feuds bent spreadsheets into weapons. But within that ongoing thrum, a slightly different signal began to hum. Partners who had been allergic to Genoa City's volatility noticed that a few deals here were now structured around conditions rather than charisma. Younger executives quietly built their own lanterns by other names, mapping out in advance what data they would not touch and what deals they would walk away from. Even if the numbers glittered, a handful of repeat rumor merchants discovered that there was no longer fetched peak prices when presented to rooms that demanded receipts. Victor Newman remained Victor Newman and would for as long as history allowed. But even he adjusted the angle of a few plays when he realized that the appetite for proxies had shrunk in the one corner where he preferred leverage to be crisp. Whether or not he had ever asked anyone to wedge Kyle and Claire apart, the calculus around that kind of gambit began to shift because the backlash-to-benefit ratio was trending the wrong direction. Audra did not disappear. She merely found herself spending more of her time convincing rooms that had grown less credulous that she still had access to engines that others did not. When the first pilot term expired, Chancellor Winters did not announce an expansion with confetti. They published the auditor's report and hosted a small closed session where skeptical stakeholders interrogated the seams. The twins dialed into that session under first names only, listened without exposing themselves to the room's curiosity, asked two precise questions, one about the false positive rate for a protected class, and one about how the clinic funds were allocated, and received the kind of answers that come from people who expect to be held to them. They did not pronounce a benediction, but they did not ask for the kill switch either. And in the silent space between those two non-acts, there was an unmistakable forward motion. Kane did not exhale like a man reprieved from execution. He exhaled like a man who had accepted a probation he intended to honor permanently. Subscribe our channel for more latest update. Phyllis, whose work had once thrived on speed as a substitute for substance, found a new kind of reputation chasing her now. The executive who understood that the fastest way to scale is to build the rails first and then drive trains on them, not the other way around. And it turned out that this kind of fame, the quiet kind, opened doors that had remained closed to her flashier persona. If you wanted to watch the city change, you could miss it by staring at headlines. Better to look at the minutes of meetings where the old shortcuts were proposed and then declined. Or at the budgets, where the line items for independent oversight grew instead of shrank. Or at the kitchen tables where families like the twins set terms for their participation in their elders' plans and watched those terms be honored. That was the true metric more than savings captured or fraud interdicted or operational KPIs, though those were strong. The metric that matters in places like this is whether the next generation believes the last generation learned anything worth inheriting. Nothing about this arc guaranteed that belief. It merely made it possible. And in a city famous for teaching hard lessons, late possibility itself was a revolution carried forward, not by speeches but by signatures. Not by proclamations but by policies that survived stress. Not by the disappearance of rumor, but by the cultivation of a norm where rumor starved when it failed to find friction points it could ignite. Phyllis kept showing up, not because showing up absolved anything, but because showing up to do the unglamorous work of maintenance is how breakthroughs avoid becoming scandals. Devon kept taking calls from people who needed a grown-up in the room and kept declining the temptation to become a puppet master in exchange for that trust. Lily kept wearing the twin mantles of empathy and firmness until other leaders remembered what a core looks like. Nate kept choosing rooms where truth didn't need an attorney. And even on the days when grief returned with teeth, he had a set of practices that dulled them. Kane kept building the thing he could show his kids without wincing, which in the end was the only reason to build anything.